a story of unwavering love and unthinkable despair. Every now and again, I encounter a story that truly settles deep within my soul. While many tales I share are distressing, today's account of a missing hiker named Mike Turner is particularly poignant. It was a difficult narrative to unravel, filled with such raw emotion that it genuinely affected me. So consider this a profound warning. What you are about to hear is, in my personal opinion, deeply upsetting, yet it's a vital story carrying immense weight. The ultimate lesson here, I believe, is the profound importance of treasuring your loved ones while they are still with you. You'll understand why as this heartbreaking journey unfolds. For those of you prepared to listen to this tale, if you are drawn to the strange, dark, and mysterious, presented in a compelling story format, then you've found your place. We delve into these narratives weekly. Given the intensity of what's to come, perhaps a moment of shared reflection is in order. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1998, a 48-year-old or 6'6" tall hiker named Mike Turner paused, took his bottle from his backpack, and sipped. Mike stood in a cluster of trees on the side of a mountain, about 11,000 feet up, within an area in Wyoming called the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. The Fitzpatrick Wilderness is easily one of the most visually striking places in the world. It's as if all the extremes of nature collided in this one location. Massive 13,000-foot tall snow-covered mountain peaks, glaciers, and then, right at their base, lush green fields brimming with tall grass, wildflowers, roaming animals, and winding streams and lakes. It's absolutely picturesque. In fact, some photographs of this area appear almost surreal. But the true reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was renowned for its unbelievable beauty was its near-untouched state due to its sheer inaccessibility. Essentially, the only people who set foot in this surreal landscape were truly experienced outdoorsmen like Mike Turner, as it demanded significant expertise simply to reach and survive in this incredibly rugged terrain. However, Mike Turner wasn't content with merely visiting the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. He yearned to experience its true essence. So he was hiking off-trail, deep in a remote area not even marked on a map. To anyone unfamiliar with map and compass navigation in the wild, this might seem utterly reckless, and to a degree, it is. Yet, it's a skill some people possess innately. Mike was one of those individuals, an excellent navigator. Walking off-trail in such a remote place was almost routine for him. Mike wasn't a full-time adventurer. Hiking was a passion. His profession was a reverend at a Christian church in Idaho, a role he'd held for 10 years. Mike adored being a reverend. He loved his congregation and his wife, Diane, and their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, were all deeply involved in the church. It was a fulfilling life. But being a reverend also entailed significant work, responsibility, and stress. Hiking became Mike's coping mechanism for this growing stress. Ironically, he found that he felt closer to God while hiking in nature than while preaching inside his church. He viewed the world as a grand gift from God, and imagining himself in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, gazing upon this unbelievable terrain. It truly looked divinely crafted. With that context, on this particular day when Mike stopped to sip water 11,000 feet up the mountainside, it was actually the 4th day of a 9-day, pre-planned solo hike through this wilderness that Mike had been meticulously planning for over a year. Even though Mike was a highly skilled hiker, backpacker, and survivalist, he knew that undertaking any really long solo hike carried a host of risks unique to solitary journeys. The biggest risk: if you get into trouble while alone, you are, by definition, alone. Therefore, a solid plan for dealing with trouble was paramount. Mike had devised an excellent plan. He'd spent that entire year mapping out this off-trail path he intended to take over 9 days, a 60-mile trip through the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. He meticulously marked his expected route on a map, detailing coordinates and his anticipated location for each day. This map, along with precise instructions, he gave to his wife Diane, who was also an enthusiastic hiker. He told her, on the 9th day, you'll meet me at this specific spot at the end of the 60 miles at noon. On this 9th day, right here, and I will meet you there, and you can take me home." However, that plan had changed on that 4th day as Mike sipped his water on the mountainside. And only Mike knew it because he had no means of communicating with his friends and family. Cell phones were very primitive at the time. He couldn't just call someone. Essentially, if he deviated from his plan, he was the only one who would know. The reason Mike decided to alter his course on the 4th day of this 9-day trip made perfect sense. Although Mike was technically solo hiking, he wasn't truly alone. With him was the family dog, Andy, a very good-natured black lab mix who loved hiking. Over the course of the previous day and into this 4th day, he and Andy had been at an elevation of about 13,000 feet, traversing icy parts of the mountain. Andy's paws were becoming raw from walking on the jagged ice. That day, the 4th day, Mike had noticed Andy whimpering and struggling to keep up, when normally Andy was super energetic and running all over. Mike knew that his planned course for the next few days involved navigating these mountains with more ice, and he didn't think Andy could keep up. He wouldn't be able to do it. So, Mike had decided to skirt the mountains to avoid the ice. Even though this path would definitely take him a little longer, it would still lead him to the same destination, that same pickup spot where his wife and family would be waiting for him. Mike understood that by deviating his route, not only would his family be unaware of his whereabouts, but this secondary path, taken to save Andy's paws, would also take longer than the original course. He knew he wouldn't arrive at the promised time. Not at noon on the 9th day. It would likely be the 10th day, or even beyond. But Mike had prepared for this contingency. He had brought extra supplies specifically for extending his journey. He felt confident that even though this was a significant risk, taking a path no one knew he was on, he could do it without problems. After Mike finished sipping his water, he pulled a bowl from his pack for Andy, poured in some water, and placed it on the ground. Andy made his way over and began lapping at the water. As he did, Mike looked down and saw Andy's tail wagging happily. Seeing how much better his dog already seemed, Mike felt confident that this was absolutely the right decision. Taking the secondary route was definitely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, Andy suddenly stopped, then lifted his head, ears perked, as if sensing something. Before Mike could stop him, Andy just took off running into the trees and disappeared. Now, Andy was a playful dog who periodically ran around on hikes like this. But remember, Mike was deep in the backcountry and had deviated his path. He needed to be absolutely certain of his location. He couldn't afford mistakes. If Andy went rogue and Mike had to chase after him, the chances of getting turned around or lost, or even encountering a large predator that Andy might have sensed, were quite high. So, Mike grabbed the bowl and took off running into the trees after Andy. He emerged on the other side, and suddenly he was hit with this incredible view, looking down towards a lake. There was a huge clearing on the side of the mountain, filled with enormous boulders, some the size of small cars. They were everywhere. Basically, as the mountain eroded, chunks of rock had rolled down into this clearing, which sloped towards the lake, filling the entire area with boulders. You couldn't truly walk on solid ground. The only way to get from where Mike was to where Andy was, because at this point, he could see his dog making his way towards the lake. Clearly, that's what Andy had sensed, the lake, and he was going to get a drink Wes to climb onto the boulders and jump from rock to rock, all the way to his dog. Mike tried calling for Andy one more time to stop and come back, but Andy was on his own program, heading for the lake. Resigned, Mike climbed onto the first boulder and began jumping from boulder to boulder in the direction of his dog. 1 week later, on the afternoon of August 9th, Mike's wife, Diane, along with her 3 children and some family friends, stood at the start of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail. This was the designated meeting spot where Mike said he would meet his family at the end of his 9-day journey. As Diane stood there, she anxiously checked her watch. Mike was late, not just a few minutes, but a full 24 hours late. Mike was supposed to be there on the 8th at noon, and now it was the 9th, and he still hadn't arrived. But remember, Mike was a man who did things like this fairly regularly. He was very competent in the wild. Everyone knew that when he embarked on this journey, there was some variability to his actual arrival time at the meeting place. Despite Mike saying, "I'll be there on the 8th at noon," Diane and her friends and family all sort of felt, well, I hope he's there at noon, but realistically, he might be several hours or even a day late, and that's okay. So, the day before, when he didn't show up at noon, people were anxious, but they were fine. Now, 24 hours later, and still no sign of Mike, Diane, her kids, and the family friends were starting to worry. In fact, before Mike left on this trip, he told Diane that if, for some reason, he didn't show up on the 9th to 24 hours after he said he would be there, and it was past 4 p.m. on the 9th. That was the trigger point for Diane to call the authorities and assume something was wrong and send out a search party. So Diane checked her watch on the 9th, and soon enough, it was 4 p.m. Mike wasn't there. 4:05, 4:10, 4:15. Still no Mike. And even though she knew her husband said, "Now it's time, go get the authorities," she just couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt it was such a monumental undertaking to organize a search party out there. It was a massive, super expensive effort. And she felt that the second she told authorities, Mike would come walking out of the wilderness with a big story to tell and a big apology for being late. So she convinced herself, you know what? Give him one more day. I'm sure he's bound to show up. But the next day, on the 10th, when there was still no sign of Mike that morning, Diane did go to the authorities and reported Mike missing. Just as she expected, a massive search was launched for Mike. But you need to keep in mind that Diane, the searchers, and everyone besides Mike had no idea that he had altered his path. They were going to be searching this massive expanse of wilderness where, even under the best conditions, knowing exactly where someone is on their route, it's incredibly difficult to find people. It's totally rugged. Things are obscured from view from the air and land. There are areas you can't even access. There are predators out there. This is a dangerous undertaking. And again, they didn't know he wasn't even on that original path anymore. He had deviated. So, despite helicopters in the air, horseback teams out in force, and hundreds of volunteers combing the area looking for Mike, nobody found a trace of him. After 2 weeks passed with this huge search yielding nothing, they finally had to call it off. Mike's family, of course, was unbelievably devastated, with no idea what had happened to him. 5 days later, on August 28th, a couple of backpackers were hiking through an area in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, about 17 miles away from the last known sighting of Mike Turner. This wasn't when he went through the trees and saw the boulders. This was around the time Mike literally began his 9-day epic journey. Someone had seen him in one area. So, where these two backpackers were was about 17 miles from there. These two backpackers were aware that Mike Turner was missing, because flyers were posted all over the outside of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness at the beginning of all the trailheads and in town. So, they were aware of Mike's disappearance and that his dog was missing. As they sat there, taking a break, a totally emaciated, dragged-looking black lab emerged from the tree line, whimpering and appearing to be on its last legs. It was Andy. Immediately, these backpackers knew. That's the missing dog. They lured the dog to them with granola bars, and Andy approached and ate. They gave him water, and thankfully, Andy would survive and make a full recovery. After these backpackers had Andy in their possession, they immediately contacted authorities, who then got in touch with Mike's family and said, "Hey, we found Andy." You can imagine the absolute roller coaster of emotion Mike Turner's family went through, knowing Andy was okay. Andy had come out of the forest, and they thought, oh my goodness, maybe Mike is okay too. Maybe Andy can lead us back to where Mike is. Mike is this totally skilled survivalist. He has to be alive out there. So, After discovering Andy, a second search was launched, using Andy as a guide dog. They basically went to the spot where the backpackers found him, and Andy's family and some other volunteers allowed Andy to lead them back into the wilderness, hoping it would lead them to Mike. As this new search began with Andy leading the way, a separate backpacker, whom we'll call Brian for the sake of the story, was hiking through a different section of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, not near where Andy was. This was a separate area. Brian wasn't involved in looking for Mike Turner, but he was aware that Mike was missing because, again, he had seen all the missing person flyers. He had seen the news, and when he began his own hike into the wilderness, he had seen, at the start of his own trailhead, a big flyer with a picture of Mike Turner and his dog, stating he was missing. So Brian was aware of Mike Turner's absence, but he was just going on his own hike into the wilderness. After a few days of solo hiking his way into this totally rugged expanse, he eventually reached a dense cluster of trees about 11,000 feet up on the side of a mountain. He walked through those trees, and when he emerged on the other side, out in front of him, sloping down to a lake, was this unbelievable boulder field that practically took his breath away. But that wasn't what truly captured his attention. Instead, as he took in these boulders and this unbelievable view of the mountains in the distance and this lake, he noticed a man sitting on a rock fairly far across this boulder field, with his back to Brian, just staring at the lake. Now, remember, this was the middle of nowhere, and Brian certainly wasn't expecting to come across any other person on this journey. So, naturally, he thought, okay, I need to go up and make sure this guy is okay, or if nothing else, I want to talk to him. I mean, it's a very rare thing to come into contact with other people out here. So, Brian began walking towards the guy to see what was going on. That man was the missing hiker, Mike Turner. And my goodness, did Mike Turner have a story to tell. To understand Mike's story, we need to go back 29 days. To the point when Andy, the dog, had taken off running from Mike, had gone into the boulder field. And Mike had emerged through those trees and seen the boulders, seen his dog, and began climbing onto that first rock to begin making his way towards his dog. So, Mike gets up on that rock and he begins hopping from boulder to boulder to boulder. At first, it's going fine. He gets about halfway across the boulder field, yelling to Andy to stay put, and he's kind of making his way, it's all good. But then he reaches this one particularly large boulder that, when he jumped onto it, was kind of unstable and began to wobble under his feet. Instinctively, Mike tried to leap off the wobbly boulder onto another boulder that was right nearby. But when he jumped, he sort of undershot this second boulder and so did not land on it and stay put on it. Instead, he kind of hit the face of the second boulder and slipped down to the ground. It didn't hurt Mike. He's just now on the ground in this small space between the boulders. However, unfortunately, the wobbly boulder right behind Mike didn't just continue to wobble. It wobbled to the point where it rolled forward and literally came to a rest against the second boulder that Mike had just jumped onto and failed to land on top of. Basically, the wobbly boulder impacted the second boulder, sandwiching Mike between them. But critically, it did not harm Mike. This is going to take some explaining, but it will make sense after I go through it. The wobbly boulder had what looked like almost a U-shaped cutout on its face. Like imagine a perfectly round boulder, but there's a divot kind of sitting on the front of it. And it just so happened that on the second boulder in front of the wobbly boulder, it also had a sort of divot on its face, kind of looking like a U-shape. And when these two boulders collided, these 800-pound boulders, Mike happened to be standing exactly in the position where those two cutouts wrapped around him like shackles. They basically pinned his ankles together where he could not pull his legs up and out of this totally tight space that was just big enough to hold his legs in place. It was like he was anchored to the ground. But again, Mike was unharmed. His legs weren't broken. He wasn't battered. Nothing. He just could not move. Mike instantly would have known this was a really big issue because he couldn't move these 800-pound boulders. They were 800 pounds, and he was by himself, minus his dog, who couldn't really help him with the boulders. So Mike immediately just jumped into, oh my goodness, I have to find a way to somehow just move these boulders. Even just a millimeter, a centimeter would be enough to free his feet. So he pulled off his bag, and one by one, he pulled out every piece of equipment he had, including his camera, tripod, and his stove, and whatever he had. He did everything he could to try to pry these stupid boulders off of him, but they would not budge. After 2 hours of trying in vain to free himself, it dawned on Mike that he was not going to be able to free himself. The only way he was getting out of here was if somebody found him and rescued him. So Mike, doing his best to stay calm, pulled out his journal he had brought along for this trip in order to detail his closeness with God and what he was learning throughout this journey. He began documenting what happened to him, to include why he was in this boulder field, what he was doing when he got stuck, how he wound up in these sort of granite shackles, so to speak. He also very clearly, in his writing, was very much putting his faith in God to get him out of here. He wrote in his journal on this first day, 2 hours into this predicament, I am in your hands, Lord. I don't know what I may face. The idea being, I don't know what's going to happen to me, but my faith is in you. I know you will help me through this. After writing this initial entry, Mike turned his attention to survival. Not trying to push the boulders off, but trying to survive amidst the boulders as long as possible. So, he pulled out his blue sleeping bag and kind of wrapped it around himself to insulate himself. He got out his stove, and there was some snow in reach, and he began putting snow in his stove and melting it to create water. He also pulled his tent flap over the top of him. I mean, he was basically setting up camp inside of these boulders. And that first night must have been absolutely horrifying. The temperatures dropped down to near freezing, even though during the day it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But that night, he's in this horrible position, just trapped with his own thoughts, just hoping and praying that God was going to get him out of here. The next day, when Mike woke up, he wrote in his journal some more, detailing his biggest fears. One of them was potentially having his legs amputated. If he got out of there, the damage of losing circulation to his legs was scary. He wrote that he had food for at least a week, but he only had 2 quarts of water. And there wasn't all that much snow around him left to melt, and he was running out of fuel. So he was really worried about not having enough water, even though, very ironically, he was like 25 to 30 feet away from a lake, which he could have drank water from, but again, he's trapped to the ground. So, on the second day, Mike actually attempted to throw his water bottle, which he connected some rope to try to get it into the lake, to capture some water and pull it back to him. But when he threw it, it was just short of the water. He could not get it into the water, so he couldn't scoop any water into his bottle. And then when he tried to retrieve the bottle, as the bottle was being dragged towards him, it got wedged in some rocks, and again, he can't move. So he can't possibly fling it out of these rocks. So he couldn't even get his water bottle back. By the end of that second day, Mike's tone in his journal began to change. It wasn't totally negative yet, but he began talking about, man, I wonder what's going to happen when I run out of water. I wonder what my urine will taste like if I mix it with Crystal Light. So it was kind of like he was joking about the fact that he was going to try to make his pee taste better. But it also showed he was beginning to realize just how serious the situation was. Nobody knew where he was. He was completely off the beaten path. He had no idea if anybody even knew he was in trouble, and he was about to be out of water the next day. The next day, the third day of being trapped inside of these boulders, Mike would once again begin writing in his journal. His tone seemed a bit more optimistic, despite the fact that he hadn't solved this water crisis he was about to face. He was down to his literal last quart of water. But in his journal, he talked about how this whole trip he went on, this 9-day trip he had planned out, the whole point was to become closer to God. And he felt like, you know what? I've really done that in the past couple of days. What I wanted to achieve, having a really spiritual event here, It's happened like times 100, being trapped here. I mean, this is the closest I've ever felt to God. But you could just tell there was just an underlying sense that I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to learn from this experience. I'm not going to take stupid risks anymore. I'm going to be a better father, be a better husband, be a better reverend. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to improve as a result of this suffering I'm going through right now. However, over the next few days, that Mike continued to be trapped in these rocks with no help coming. His optimism clearly waned. He began to write that he was angry with God. He wondered, is this a punishment for something I've done? And he also thought, maybe I failed God, and that's why I'm here. But it was just clear that Mike, who was this deeply spiritual person who absolutely believed in a higher power, how could he be in this terrible position and not be getting any sort of help from God? How could that be? But unfortunately for Mike, his situation only got worse. On about day 5 or 6, as Mike was laying wretchedly inside of this horrible camp he had built, he noticed that he had completely lost feeling in his left leg. Like, completely. It was a dead leg at this point. And even though he knew by this point how bad of a situation he was in, this sparked a new, very real fear inside of him that he detailed in his journal. He knew his body was actually beginning to break down, and still there was no help, no divine help coming in, despite all his prayers. There was no one coming to rescue him. He was all alone. In fact, Mike would write in his journal something that practically brought me to tears when I read it first, and it just said, "So lonely, more than I imagined. I just can't picture what it would be like to be trapped out there. You're not hurt, but you can't go anywhere, and you're all alone, just slowly withering away, and your family. They're somewhere out there, they have no idea. Nobody knows. It's just unbelievably devastating. The mental torture this man went through is just out of this world, but it just keeps getting worse." Day 6, day 7. Mike at some point actually dropped his journal, and because he can't actually reach it anymore, he just picked up whatever objects he had and continued writing on them, like his pocket Bible. And then also, there was an instruction manual for his stove, and he would write in the margins. And his writing just continued to get more and more pessimistic and sad. He began writing about how intensely he regretted his decision to take the long route. He was totally setting himself up for this situation. Nobody would have known where he was. And so he's hating on himself. He's still mad at God. Why aren't you here? Aren't you seeing how badly I'm suffering? I mean, this is a guy who's basically losing his mind with regret and anguish and just pure loneliness. I mean, this is horrible. But then on the 7th and 8th day, or 9th day, that he was stuck in these boulders. Once again, Mike's writing on his random things that he wrote on took another turn. Not only was his writing becoming more and more illegible, because he's literally dying here. I mean, his body's breaking down, he's exposed to the sun all day. And then at night, it's freezing cold. He's not having any water. He's drinking his urine. He's got no food left. He can barely write. His writing begins to talk about his family and his children. At this point, Mike must have known the end is near, and so all he had was just the thoughts of his family. He began wondering what his kids' lives were going to be like in the future, because obviously the implication here is he knows he won't be there to see it. He'll be dead. And then, in some of the last entries he would make, it was obvious that Mike had turned back to God. Now he was back to approaching God with open arms. He was no longer upset or questioning God's plan. He was just ready. He actually wrote in his journal, "Fill me with peace, Lord. May my conditions not deny my love for you." And then he wrote, "I'm ready to die, though I'm missing my family." And then in his final entry, which must have been on the 10th day of his predicament, Mike's writing was basically completely illegible at this point because he's right on death's door. And even though you can't really tell what he wrote, at the end of this final entry it says, "Love, Dad." It was like he was saying his final goodbye to his family. Then Mike took off his wedding band and he placed it on the rock next to him, because he knew once he died and decomposed, the ring would fall off his bones and be lost in the rocks below, and he clearly wanted his family to have that wedding ring. So he placed it on the rock, and then he prepared to die. When Brian the hiker walked up to the sitting man he saw on this boulder, he realized almost immediately that that was Mike Turner, because he had seen the missing person flyers before he came into the wilderness. So, knowing this was the guy they were looking for, and knowing he couldn't move him, he covered him up. Then he took Mike Turner's wallet, which contained his ID, and as fast as he could, Brian the hiker made his way back to the beginning of the trailhead and contacted authorities. This story of Mike Turner truly highlights the fragility of life and the immense power of family bonds. It's a somber reminder of the unforeseen challenges that can arise and the enduring love that connects us even in the face of unimaginable hardship. If this story has resonated with you, consider reflecting on the simple yet profound importance of the connections we share with those we hold dear.